You're being overpaid for what you do." That was the first sentence he said to me. No introduction, no handshake, no acknowledgement of the 19 years I had given to the company. Just that one flat declaration delivered across the polished desk like a cost-saving memo. I didn't blink. I simply straightened my spine, nodded once, and said, "Understood." Then I walked out, quietly, without letting the door echo behind me. My name is Mara Ellison. For nearly 2 decades, I had led the People Operations Division at Halverson Stratex, a company that had weathered 2 recessions, 3 CEOs, and more restructuring cycles than I could count. I wasn't the loudest in the room, but I was the one people came to when budgets broke, when departments fractured, when lawsuits circled. I wasn't the face of the firm, I was the framework. My systems held people together long before they realized they were at risk of coming apart. But none of that mattered to Drew Langford, the new CEO, 35, board appointed, fresh from a consultancy with a collapsible portfolio and a vocabulary full of disruption, velocity, and performance modeling. He didn't greet the department heads when he arrived. He sent a mass email about streamlining culture, renamed all our conference rooms after abstract verbs, removed the handshake protocol, replaced it with QR code greetings. No one knew what that meant. We just stopped greeting. I was told I had a meeting with him that morning. No agenda, no context. I still prepped. Old habits. I outlined team metrics, retention data, engagement scores, systems architecture, figures that reflected the stability we had built. He didn't look up when I walked in. "You've been here how long?" he asked, eyes on his laptop. 19 years this May." He gave a quick, dry laugh. "Legacy salaries." Then, still staring at the spreadsheet in front of him, he said, "You're being overpaid for what you do. Starting next cycle, your base will be adjusted by 30%. He didn't ask for a reaction, and I didn't give him one, because that moment wasn't about my salary. It was about visibility. He didn't see me. Not really. He didn't see the quiet fire drills I'd prevented, the department reorgs I had untangled, the lawsuits I had diffused before they ever reached the general counsel's desk. He didn't see the systems. He only saw the cost line, a salary figure attached to a name he didn't care to know. What he didn't realize was that the minute he reduced my pay, he increased my clarity. Because it wasn't just disrespectful, it was instructional. That kind of dismissal doesn't come from personal animosity, it comes from arrogance. And arrogance in an unfamiliar structure is always a dangerous imbalance. I walked out of his office, not humiliated, not shaken, but activated. Because I had built the system he was trying to override. And he had just handed me a reason to let it correct itself. The next week, my office was gone. No notice, no conversation. I returned from a lunch meeting to find a new face. Early 20s, glossy smile, arranging paperweights like she'd always belonged there. She looked up, surprised only for a second. "Oh," she said, as if I were the one interrupting. "Didn't they tell you? I'm Drew's new executive assistant. He asked that I be seated closer to him." No nameplate, no explanation, just a smile and the weight of being erased. I packed my things without a word, no dramatics, no confrontation. I relocated to an old desk beside the copier, where the light flickered overhead and the air vent clicked every 9 seconds. I counted. I always count when systems change without warning. It tells me how far the imbalance will reach. Within days, I was removed from the weekly strategy call. My name vanished from calendar invites, my inbox filled with generic administrative requests, work I hadn't done in over a decade. Meanwhile, the assistant, whose name I would later learn was Kendra, was given shadow access to the entire People Systems database. Payroll, contracts, compliance archives, all of it. "Just so she can learn the ropes," Drew said, but she wasn't learning. She was harvesting. She took screenshots of org charts she didn't understand, forwarded policy updates without reading them, laughed too loudly in open areas and referred to me as Marmar in front of interns who had joined 3 weeks ago. I said nothing, because I wasn't confused. I was documenting every misrouted contract, every compliance risk ignored, every flagged audit that sat unread in Drew's inbox. They thought I was passive, but I was precise. Each morning, I arrived 15 minutes early. Each evening, I stayed 20 minutes late. Quietly, without fanfare, I began backing up records, capturing version histories, reviewing every permission log tied to the systems I had designed. The safeguards I had once built for resilience, I now studied for silence. I mapped who had access, who had changed it, who had overridden which protocols. No one asked why, no one questioned my intent, because they had already decided I didn't matter. And that was their second mistake. Drew believed he had made a clean cut, but what he didn't understand was that the infrastructure he was standing on was never neutral. It had memory, it had logic, it had weight distribution, and the moment he undermined it, he started shifting pressure into places he couldn't see. I didn't need to fight. I only needed to keep watching, because a system that forgets its own foundation will always, eventually, collapse under what it tries to carry. They thought I was winding down. I was winding in, tighter, calmer. With every silent week that passed, I didn't fade. I focused. Each day I reviewed a different piece of our internal infrastructure. Not to preserve it, to understand what would happen when it failed. Because failure was no longer a risk, it was a timeline. I watched Kendra as she clicked through files she didn't comprehend. I tracked version edits, seeing her overwrite forms without logging changes. She forwarded compliance memos to the wrong addresses, filed contracts under the wrong quarters, and deleted names from escalation charts because they looked outdated. No one corrected her. Drew encouraged it. "We need new eyes," he said in a staff meeting. "Old systems preserve old problems." But the old system wasn't the problem. The ignorance of it was. So I began writing again. Not policy, not memos, just one document. A private archive. A plain text log of access changes, policy reversals, missed review checkpoints, and incorrect data handling. I wasn't building a case. I was creating a timeline. Something the system itself couldn't delete because it no longer knew it existed. I also reconnected with someone no one remembered. Monica Liu. She had started in tech support, quietly risen through the infrastructure team, and now managed back-end security workflows, silently, surgically, and without any need for credit. Years ago, I had advocated for her promotion when her manager wanted to outsource the entire support tier. She hadn't forgotten. When I messaged her, I only wrote one sentence. "If the continuity shield were ever breached, could we redirect admin ownership safely?" She replied with 3 words. "Already designed it." We met that evening, not in the office, not on company servers, just 2 people who understood that what we had once built to preserve others might now need to preserve itself. We reviewed access chains. We noted the fail-safes that had not yet been compromised. We activated the dormant override protocol, originally meant for blackout or leadership incapacitation. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't malicious. It was simply there. Buried deep in our continuity handbook, co-authored by me in a year when no one wanted to fund disaster planning. Now it would do what it was designed for, protect the system from those who no longer knew how to protect it themselves. The first thing to disappear wasn't a policy. It was my name. Quietly, without ceremony, I removed it from every structure that required active consent. Payroll override authorizations, contract escalation paths, system ownership declarations. I withdrew from all of them, formally and within policy. No one noticed. Drew had stopped looking at signatures. Kendra didn't know what half the forms were for. They assumed it was all still intact. And in a way, it was, just no longer held by me. That's when I wrote the letter. Not a resignation, not a warning. A declaration of disassociation, terse, legal, tactile. Effective immediately, I withdraw all personal liability and executive authority from platforms, protocols, and workflows built under my direction. No access granted under my name remains valid unless mutually reauthorized in writing. Signed, M. Ellison. I printed 1 copy, sealed it, sent it by internal courier to legal, marked for audit file only. No double C, no explanation, just presence. Then I activated the trigger. The continuity override I'd configured with Monica was never meant to be loud. It didn't shut things down, it just removed privileges. Shifted system ownership from individuals to the framework itself. A digital transition from trust-based authority to lockstep logic. Overnight, admin tokens began to expire. By morning, platform access requests piled up unanswered. Drew sent a group message asking who had changed the architecture. Monica responded, Nothing was changed, just reverted. He didn't reply. 2 days later, he called a department sync. Agenda: crisis response and cost optimization. Kendra arrived late, flustered, holding a report she clearly hadn't read. I sat in the back, still officially in strategic support. No one asked for my input. No one noticed I hadn't logged in using my usual credentials. They didn't even notice I hadn't logged in at all, because in their minds, I had already been removed. But in reality, I had simply removed myself. From risk, from blame, from the systems they were now trying to pilot without a map. And the strangest part, I didn't feel angry. I felt ready. Because for the first time, I wasn't holding anything up. And they were about to find out what that absence really meant. The first signs weren't dramatic. There was no system crash, no emergency alert, no loud confrontation in a conference room. It began, as these things often do, with a routine inquiry. Payroll reported missing access to update compensation records. Legal followed, flagging authentication failures when attempting to retrieve contract archives. Compliance reported an audit trail that suddenly stopped halfway through a report. No one panicked. Not yet. The assumption was simple. Someone forgot to grant the right permissions. A glitch, a refresh, an easy fix. But the fixes didn't work. Requests bounced, credentials failed. Approval chains returned empty. The systems weren't broken. They were intact, but unreachable. Like a network that remembered what it once allowed, but no longer recognized who was asking. Kendra responded with vague reassurances. System caches needed resetting. There had been an internal migration. Everything was just a bit delayed. But there had been no migration, no roadmap, no change request documentation, no IT ticket, only systems asking for authority that no one could provide. And still, no one asked me. That part was almost poetic. They had spent weeks phasing me out of the narrative so thoroughly that it no longer occurred to them I might be the only one who could answer their questions. And so I watched, distant, calm, and entirely unbothered, as the structure began to strain beneath the weight of their assumption. Drew called a meeting. He labeled it process optimization, but the tension in the room made it obvious. No one spoke in complete sentences. Kendra walked in 10 minutes late, carrying reports she hadn't written, referencing data she hadn't understood. And when Drew asked if the compliance system could be restored before the client review, her answer was confident, but hollow. That was the moment the first resignation came through. One of the directors I had mentored 5 years ago submitted her formal notice, citing organizational misalignment. No elaboration, no transition memo, just a clean, silent exit. She was followed by 2 more in the same week. Their roles weren't filled. Their workloads were redistributed to project managers who weren't briefed. Errors multiplied, slowly but visibly. A benefits renewal cycle stalled. A hiring requisition form routed itself into a loop. Legal didn't get a chance to review a vendor renewal, and the contract auto-expired. From the outside, nothing had fallen. But on the inside, the floor was beginning to shift, and I wasn't surprised. Because none of this was sabotage. None of it was vengeance. It was consequence. The system wasn't rejecting people. It was simply functioning without the one thing they never learned to value: stewardship. They had removed the person who held the logic, the memory, the subtle pressure points that made the machine move smoothly. And now they were watching it drag under its own weight. No one noticed the silence until it replaced their certainty. But I had seen it coming long before the lights began to flicker. Each morning brought a new friction point, a permissions error here, a data sync delay there. Security clearance gaps began appearing in vendor access, employee portals failed to load correctly, and performance review tools began auto-expiring long before their deadlines. At first, these were brushed aside as ordinary misalignments, glitches to be assigned, delegated, postponed. But they didn't resolve. They multiplied. They fed into one another, because the system they inherited wasn't designed to run on autopilot. It was designed to be stewarded. And they had removed the one person who knew how. By the end of the second week, the leadership dashboard stopped syncing with internal KPIs. HR analytics stalled. Turnover tracking, once a real-time snapshot of company health, went dark. Drew asked IT to perform a deep sweep. Monica responded through proper channels, noting that no anomalies were detected. The system, she wrote, was operating within expected parameters. She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. Because the issue wasn't inside the system. It was around it. What Drew and Kendra failed to understand was that the infrastructure didn't fail because it was fragile. It failed because it had been built to require care. The kind of care that doesn't show up on spreadsheets. The kind that lives in memory, in consistency, in the steady presence of someone who sees problems 2 steps before they happen. When that presence is removed, the structure doesn't explode. It frays, it hesitates, and eventually it ceases to respond altogether. The client portals began timing out. One of our largest partners, a global logistics firm, emailed requesting clarification on recent delays in contract fulfillment. The message was short, professional, and unmistakably cold. I didn't reply. That wasn't my job anymore. But I saved a copy of the email anyway because it confirmed what I already knew. The unraveling was no longer internal. It had reached the surface. That same afternoon, another resignation came through. This time, a lead in compliance. No warning, no meeting. Just a quiet message to the internal comms team requesting the removal of her profile from the org chart. She had been there for 9 years. She didn't leave out of fear. She left out of clarity. The kind that only comes when you realize the work you believed in has been handed to someone who never learned how to carry it. Word began to travel, not loudly, not in gossip, but in tone. Conversation shortened. People stopped volunteering for cross-team initiatives. Project managers began double-checking access logs, not because they were instructed to, but because they no longer trusted the flow. The company hadn't collapsed, but it no longer felt anchored. And even those who hadn't yet named the shift could feel it. They started asking where I had gone, not directly, but quietly, in passing, with a kind of tone that said they weren't asking if I was coming back. They were asking if there was still something left to come back to. And that was the moment I knew the unraveling was complete, because by the time people start remembering your absence more clearly than they ever acknowledged your presence, the system isn't failing. It's already failed. The official breakdown began on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because a former colleague texted me at 9:13 a.m. It was a screenshot. The payroll system dashboard read, "Administrator access revoked, contact primary system owner." And underneath it, a timestamp that no one could override. There was no primary system owner anymore. They had removed her. Throughout the day, notifications spread. The HR platform refused to generate offer letters. The compliance interface locked itself into archived view. Onboarding systems began looping through null fields. From the outside, the company still looked functional. Emails went out. Zoom links still connected. But beneath it, the infrastructure no longer moved. No one knew where decisions were supposed to land. And without that spine, nothing stuck. Drew convened an emergency operations meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. The aftershocks were public. By noon, 5 department heads had pinged legal for policy clarification. By 3, IT confirmed that several back-end logs had been scrubbed of trace metadata, something Monica had done weeks earlier per protocol. And by 5, a quiet but undeniable realization settled across the leadership floor. The company's core people systems were no longer accessible. Not damaged, not deleted, just unreachable. No one panicked, not yet. People still believed in short-term fixes. They asked for backups. They requested sandbox restores. But the systems responded the same way every time. Request denied, insufficient clearance. They called the vendor. The vendor referred them to the internal system license holder. And that, they realized, was me. I didn't answer their calls, not because I wanted revenge, but because there was nothing left to say. They had removed my title. They had reduced my scope. They had dismissed my role as outdated. And with it, they dismissed every safeguard I had personally constructed, documented, and maintained for nearly 2 decades. And now they were learning what happens when you treat a system architect like a replaceable task manager. The silence they had assigned to me was now echoing through their operations. That evening, as Drew sat in his glass office with the blinds partially drawn, I heard from someone who had once worked closely with him, a finance director who had since moved on to a competitor. Her message was brief. "He looks like a man trying to hold a structure he no longer understands. You did this without touching anything." She wasn't wrong, because collapse, when done right, doesn't need force. It only needs absence. By Wednesday, nothing functioned as intended. Work continued, technically. People showed up, meetings were held, but no one trusted the systems anymore. Every approval was double-checked. Every email was forwarded 3 times for confirmation. Documents were printed in triplicate, an act that hadn't been necessary in over a decade. Confidence had drained from the workflow, and in its place was a quiet kind of chaos. The finance portal was the first to go dark. Then the benefits interface refused to load during open enrollment. Legal was locked out of precedent templates, and the new head of compliance submitted a ticket asking where the legacy risk index had gone. There was no answer, because the people who had the answers were gone. Not out of revenge, not in anger, just gone. I watched it all unfold from a high-floor conference room at a different company. My new office, a quieter one, a safer one that had already begun implementing the systems I had spent years perfecting elsewhere. I hadn't reached out to anyone from my old firm, but they began reaching out to me. Carefully, cautiously. First, it was the intern I had once recommended for a training program, now a team lead. Then a former colleague from operations. Then someone from the ethics committee. The messages varied in tone, but they all circled the same quiet truth. They understood now. What I had done, what I had protected, what they had allowed to be dismantled. One of them wrote, "They told us you were holding us back, but it turns out you were the only one holding us together." I didn't reply, not out of coldness, but because I knew their words weren't for me. They were for themselves, for the part of them that had watched my removal in silence and now understood what it had cost them. Back at Halverson, Drew began shifting blame. He blamed the vendors, then the legacy systems, then uncoordinated transitions. But the board had already requested an external audit. That was the final thread, because an audit doesn't just ask what went wrong, it asks who knew and who allowed it. I had kept records, not because I planned to expose anything, but because documentation is what professionals do when others forget how memory works. I had no intention of weaponizing it. I didn't need to. The system was already doing that on its own. Later that week, a press release was issued. Polished, neutral, forgettable. Drew was stepping down to pursue new opportunities. The words said nothing, but the silence behind them said everything. Kendra was gone 2 days later. No announcement, no farewell email, just an empty desk and a missing name from the directory. The organization didn't collapse in a blaze. It unraveled, then sagged, then finally fell into itself. Quietly, predictably, without a villain, without a hero. Just cause and effect, playing out exactly as it always does when ego tries to replace experience. They hadn't fired me. They had released the one thing they never knew they needed. And in doing so, they finally learned the difference between managing a system and understanding one. The request never arrived in formal language, but it didn't need to. The signs were quiet, deliberate, threaded into the kinds of conversations that come after a storm has passed, and leadership finally realizes which structures were load-bearing all along. A message from an old contact on the board, framed as a casual check-in, a coffee invitation from someone who hadn't spoken to me in years, now mentioning strategic continuity and restoring operational trust. Even Monica forwarded me a company-wide note she thought I should see. An open call for temporary advisors to help re-stabilize core people systems. None of them said my name, but they didn't have to. They weren't asking me to return. They were hoping I hadn't fully left. By then, I was already seated in a different office, under a different roof, surrounded by a different kind of quiet. Not the silence that comes from being overlooked, but the space that opens up when you're finally allowed to build without interference. The new company wasn't louder. It wasn't flashier. But it recognized something my former employer never had. That value isn't earned by staying in the room longest or speaking the most eloquently. It's measured by what still functions when everything else begins to fail. I began slow, not by redesigning policies or launching initiatives, but by restoring memory. Mapping systems not just by function, but by intention. Naming assumptions that had gone unquestioned for years. Restructuring delegation flows so that authority didn't disappear in the absence of one title. These were the kinds of things no one celebrated in quarterly slides, but everyone felt when they were absent. I wasn't recreating my old work, I was refining it, this time in a place that knew what it was receiving. People didn't approach me with performance decks, they came with real questions, real frictions, asking not how to scale faster, but how to scale without breaking the people carrying the weight. One afternoon, a mid-level strategist lingered after a session, a paper note folded in her hand. She waited until the others had left, then placed it gently on my desk. "You reminded me that resilience doesn't have to be loud," it said, "and that leaving quietly doesn't mean you disappear." I reread it once after she left, not because I needed the recognition, but because it confirmed something I had never said aloud. Not to her, not to myself. That perhaps legacy doesn't reside in what we build when we're allowed to finish. Perhaps it lives in what continues to stand, even after we've been removed. And in this new space, where no one asked me to prove what I already knew, I felt something shift. Not a resurgence of ambition, not triumph. Just clarity. The story didn't end when the systems failed. It didn't end when Drew stepped down or when compliance swept quietly through the corridors he once commanded. It didn't even end when Kendra's name vanished from the org chart overnight. Stories like this never end at the collapse. They only begin again, elsewhere, in places built without the pretense of legacy, but with the discipline of learning. At the new firm, my title carried weight, but it wasn't the kind you wear like armor. It was quiet, earned, and functional. I had no need to broadcast influence because the work had already proven itself. People brought questions they hadn't felt safe voicing elsewhere. Not because I invited them to speak, but because I made it unnecessary to ask permission. The culture shifted, not with grand speeches or sweeping change, but with small realignments, each one rooted in the knowledge that people stay not for perks, but for protection. I began a cohort, not for rising executives, but for those often left at the margins. Women over 40, professionals returning from caregiving, employees who had weathered too many reorganizations to trust easily, but hadn't yet forgotten how to care. It wasn't flashy, there was no press release. We met in borrowed rooms with blank whiteboards. And still, the room filled, again and again, because when you create a space where experience isn't treated like excess weight, people show up differently. One participant, a woman who had once been dismissed as unscalable, left me a note after our final session. It said, "You gave me a future I didn't know I was still allowed to imagine." I folded it carefully and placed it in my drawer, not because I needed the reminder, but because it deserved to be held. And while all of that was happening, quiet, steady, restorative, I received a final message from someone I hadn't thought about in weeks. Monica forwarded it from her personal inbox. It was a formal HR notice from Halverson's board, dated 2 weeks after Drew's departure. As of next quarter, all systems, processes, and policies attributed to prior leadership will undergo external review for long-term viability. Beneath it, a footnote in smaller text. Legacy knowledge retention remains a critical risk. It wasn't signed by anyone I recognized. I closed the email without response. Because by then, they weren't asking for me. They were asking for what I had taken with me. That's the part they never understood. You can replace a nameplate, you can strip a title. But if you dismiss the one who built the foundation, not just structurally, but culturally, you don't simply lose a person. You lose the memory of how it was all held together. And without that, even your repair work becomes guesswork. Legacy isn't written in resignation letters or retirement speeches. It's not enshrined in corner offices or preserved in corporate photo walls. Legacy lives in the questions people start asking because you once made it safe to ask. It echoes in the systems that remain stable long after you've gone. It breathes through the voices you once mentored, now steady enough to mentor others. And it stands, unshaken, in the space between what they tried to replace and what they can never replicate. I don't think about Drew often. When I do, it's not with anger, it's with clarity. He wasn't the architect of my downfall. He was the architect of his own. And the only part I played was stepping aside just long enough for gravity to finish the work. Some people confuse silence for weakness. They believe if you leave quietly, you were never really there. But I know better. And now, so do they. I used to believe that walking away was a kind of surrender. Now I know it's what makes space for everything they can't erase.